Hi, this is Impact Curriculum World History, and today we're talking about the Cold War, which had absolutely no chance of destroying humanity 7 times over. In fact, the Cold War was neither cold nor was it a war. It was more of a lukewarm conflict.
Sabrina, I have a question.
What, Ethan from the past?
You know how Russia, North Korea, and China are threatening the US right now?
Yes.
Well, it really seems like kind of another Cold War.
How so, Ethan from the past?
Because everyone is threatening to nuke each other. It's a little unsettling.
Don't worry, Ethan from the past. With Donald Trump in office, we'll always be safe, because he'll just invite communist leaders to his golf course in Florida and everything will be great again. Yay for Donald Trump's golf course in Florida. By the way, it's true what they say. Evil really does come from only 2 places, Germany and Florida. The Cold War, so called because of a lack of direct conflict, did become pretty lukewarm in certain areas, but it was mostly conflict between 2 ideologies, capitalism and communism. But geopolitical influence aside, neither the US nor the USSR wanted countries to stay neutral. Every country was to pick a side, whether it was capitalism or communism, and the aim of both superpowers was to influence as many countries as possible. It's like the debate on whether or not it's okay to put pineapple on pizza. You're either for it or you're not, and there's no in between. By the way, it's not okay to put pineapple on pizza. Even Chef Gordon Ramsay says so. The US saw Soviet spread of influence as a threat to democracy and capitalism, while the USSR saw American consumerism as a threat to Europe and the Soviet system. At the end of the war, the Soviets immediately forced Eastern Europe into its spheres of influence. The US created NATO with Western Europe as a defensive military alliance, and the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact with Eastern Europe as a countermeasure to US military interests. The years of the Cold War roughly go from 1945 to 1991, but some say that it started before that, during World War II, with the Soviets' distrust of Great Britain and the US, and Winston Churchill's reluctance to open a second front to the Nazis. However, Germans fled Soviet occupation regions to the other zones in search of better opportunities and freedoms, so this was a blatant failure for the Soviets. But even if this was just a lukewarm conflict, there was plenty of hot war during the Cold War. Alright, let's just cut to the cogitation globule. The US and USSR came into conflict through a series of proxy wars. These got particularly tense in Korea, where stagnant military offensives led to treaties of division. The USSR supported communist regimes and aided the North, while the US pushed from the South. In Vietnam, Communist China, which had been supported by the USSR, was able to help out North Vietnam, who wanted to unite the country under a communist regime. The US's goal was to help South Vietnam fight back against the North, but because American soldiers were fighting in unknown terrain and often got their enemies confused with the people they were supposed to help, this ultimately failed. Prior to global paranoia, the Soviets and Americans met in the late 50s in the famed kitchen debate. Nixon and Khrushchev compared their technological advancements over everything else, and things like nuclear missiles, ideological conflicts, and direct military action were barely mentioned. In the kitchen of all places. Basically, the argument went down like this.
You fat, useless sack of Yankee danky doodle shite. Off, will you please, yeah?
But all conflicts aside, the one competition everyone seems to forget is the nuclear arms race. The US had already revealed its possession of the atomic bomb during World War II, and the Soviets amassed their own arsenal of nuclear arms, no thanks to covert operations. Towards the 60s and 70s, both superpowers amassed enough nuclear missiles to destroy the world 7 times over. So that was disturbing. The proliferation of nuclear weapons culminated in the creation of a pact between the US and USSR called MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. Thanks, Cogitation Global. So, the kitchen debate was meant to compare and contrast how the US and USSR was differing in technological advancement. Both Nixon and Khrushchev realized the scientific importance of the Cold War in military developments. While Khrushchev worried about foreign arrangements with the US, Nixon had some trouble on the domestic front. Oh, it's time for the open letter? Okay. An open letter to Richard Nixon. But first, let's check what's in the secret compartment. Oh, it's Joseph Stalin's mustache. This is why the USSR lost the war. because of this atrocious piece of hair. Dear Richard Nixon, you failed at a lot of things. First, you ran a failed orange juice business which declared bankruptcy after only 18 months. Seriously, who decides to freeze the juice instead of using the concentrate? Jeez. Also, you failed at maintaining peaceful relations with the USSR. Did you really have to have the kitchen debate? It didn't achieve anything except piss off Khrushchev and make you look a little stupid. But most importantly of all, you failed at being a president. You barely advanced the civil rights movement. You wiretapped the phones of the American people and listened to their calls. And no one wants a presidency that compromises the security and constitutional rights of the American people. Right, Trump? Best wishes, Sabrina Sy. Egypt tried to nationalize the Suez Canal, but intervention from other allied powers ultimately failed. In Latin America, the U.S. overthrew the leftist government and put in its place often authoritarian regimes, even going so far as to use death squads. This was especially controversial for the Americans, but, America. Perhaps the Cuban Missile Crisis was the most well-known of Cold War conflicts. In Cuba, Fidel Castro centralized his power and organized a one-party socialist state. His alliance with the Soviet Union, along with Cuba's buildup of its nuclear arsenal, threatened the United States' position. Also, United States positioning of nuclear missiles in Turkey nearly forced a nuclear exchange, so everyone was nervous. This is an image of what would have happened if the Cuban Missile Crisis had gone bad, but it didn't, so go America. The relations between China and the Soviet Union also deteriorated. As the Soviets weakened their power, China continued to progress and was influenced by a market economy employed under Deng Xiaoping. There was also a fair bit of defiance among states under superpower influence. In the US, a blossoming civil rights movement transformed the lives of African Americans. However, women felt disadvantaged because of a newfound US policy of domestic containment. The US tried to restrict and control social norms and promote consumerism, but this had its drawbacks as well. In France, President de Gaulle forced an image of an emerging Europe independent of American influence. He amassed France's own nuclear arsenal and created the image of Europe as a great power once again. In Eastern Europe, the Soviets took direct military action and suppressed revolutionary movements and uprisings in states like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In Russia, civilians felt a desire for the standard of living that Americans and their allies had. Russian political leaders knew that there was no way that they could match US production and consumerism. Poor policies such as collectivization, stymied production, and suppression of dissent created even more social unrest and dissatisfaction. The Americans withdrew from Vietnam because of domestic distaste, and the Soviets from Afghanistan because of Afghan national resistance. And soon the world saw that the two superpowers could not maintain their hegemony and had overextended their influence. So why did the Cold War end when it did, and why did the Soviet Union collapse when it did? It all came down to economics and politics. Communism was unable to keep up with the pace of capitalist production and consumerism, and the Soviets were financially drained from their nuclear arms race. With Reagan's presidency in the US, the Soviets could not fund military development forced by Reagan, and Gorbachev's governance in the USSR opened the system to criticism and exposed its weaknesses. In 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed and East and West Germany were reunited. Poland negotiated free elections, Hungary opened its borders, and Romanian dictator Ceausescu was executed. As a result, in December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War was over. So as you can see, our discussion has branched from Europe to the Americas to Asia and Africa. And to know that two superpowers were held in check only by mutually assured destruction is hard to believe today. We can't begin to imagine the tension that the world felt during this time. The Cold War defined much of the global political landscape after World War II, and the world was divided between two superpowers. The geopolitical and ideological rivalry between the US and USSR lasted for 5 decades and affected every corner of the world. And we still continue to feel these repercussions today, even if it's past. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Impact Curriculum is produced and directed by Ethan Young. Our script supervisor is Ethan Young. Our associate producers are Erica Yu and Dan Kong. This show is written by my high school friend Ethan Young and myself. Our graphics team is Cogitation Globule in association with Dan Kong and Tiffany Lai. Thanks for watching Impact Curriculum. And as we say in my hometown,
Sabrina! Sick fun!